The rain was falling in sheets when the exhausted waitress pressed her last crumpled dollar into the stranger's cold hand. She whispered, "Get yourself something warm." He looked up at her with eyes darker than the storm. By sunrise, 3 men would lose everything they owned, and she would never wait a table again. Ruby's all-night diner sat on the corner of a forgotten street in Brooklyn, glowing like a lonely lantern against the black, wet asphalt. The neon sign in the window buzzed and flickered, the letter E in open dying, a slow death nobody had bothered to fix in 8 months. Inside, the air smelled of burnt coffee, fryer grease, and the faint sweetness of blueberry pie left too long under the heat lamp. The vinyl booths were cracked. The chrome edging on the counter had lost its shine sometime around 1997. It was 2:47 in the morning on a rainy Tuesday, and Hazel Monroe was finishing the 16th hour of a double shift she couldn't afford to refuse. At 26 years old, Hazel stood 5'6", carried her weight in her hips and her shoulders, and wore her chestnut hair pulled back into a low ponytail that had been coming loose for the last 4 hours. Her uniform, a pale blue button-down and black apron, pulled a little too tight across her chest, and she had stopped caring about that particular indignity around the same time she stopped caring about her aching feet. A worn silver locket rested against her collarbone. It had belonged to her father. She never took it off. Hazel remembered every regular by name. She knew that Mr. Petrov, the widowed cab driver, took his coffee with 3 sugars and hated when anyone mentioned his late wife. She knew that Denny, the construction foreman, was trying to lose weight, so she slipped him an extra piece of bacon and told him it was a mistake from the kitchen. She knew that the homeless man everyone called Old Sam nursed a single cup of coffee for 3 hours because Ruth, the ancient line cook with hands twisted by arthritis, had told her years ago that no one got turned out into the cold on their shift. Not on Hazel's watch. Not ever. The bell above the door jingled, and Hazel's stomach dropped before she even looked up. Marcus Vale swaggered in, smelling of cheap bourbon and expensive cologne, 40 minutes late for his own shift as manager. He was 32, thin as a whip, with a kind of face that had once been handsome before entitlement rotted it from the inside out. His uncle owned a mid-sized real estate firm in Midtown, which was the only reason Marcus had a job that required him to do anything other than fail upward. Hazel, sweetheart. Marcus leaned against the pie case and looked her up and down with a smirk that made her skin crawl. That uniform's fighting for its life again. Huh? Maybe skip the pancakes on your break tonight. Just a suggestion. He laughed at his own joke. 2 customers at the counter pretended not to hear. Ruth, watching from the pass-through, tightened her jaw until the muscle jumped. "Yes, Mr. Vale," Hazel said, her voice steady, her face blank. She had learned long ago that reacting only fed him. "Oh, and table 6 complained the coffee was lukewarm. That's coming out of your tips." Marcus dropped an empty mug on her tray and walked toward the back office. Table 6 had been empty for 2 hours. There had been no complaint. There never was. He just took what he wanted because he could, and Hazel had $8 in her apron and $47 in her bank account, and rent was 3 weeks late, and Jamie's ventilator alarm had gone off twice last night, and she could not afford to lose this job over a lukewarm cup of coffee that never existed. She walked into the back alley to breathe. The rain hit her face, and she let it, because it was the only water on her cheeks she could explain. 6 years ago her father, Detective Frank Monroe of the 75th Precinct, had been shot dead in a stairwell in East New York, chasing a suspect who was never caught. Her mother had remarried a widower in Arizona within 18 months and stopped answering Hazel's calls. 2 years after that, a drunk driver ran a red light on Atlantic Avenue and hit the passenger side of Hazel's car. Hazel walked away with a bruised sternum. Her little brother Jamie, then 16 years old and asleep in the passenger seat, did not walk away at all. The medical bills had climbed to $140,000. The spinal surgery Jamie needed to have any chance of walking again cost another $80,000 on top of that. Hazel had dropped out of John Jay College of Criminal Justice the week of the accident. She had been 3 semesters away from a criminology degree and a shot at the academy, following her father's footsteps into the Shield. Now she was 3 weeks behind on rent and 1 bad shift away from eviction. A shadow peeled itself off the brick wall at the end of the alley. Vic Ramone, one of Damien Thorne's collectors, stepped into the yellow light of the fire exit. Thick-necked, expressionless, holding a folded umbrella he didn't bother to open. He didn't touch her. He never touched her. He didn't have to. "Mr. Thorne says Friday, doll." Vic's voice was almost gentle. 9,000 by Friday, or the boy loses his spot on the surgery list. And that little apartment of yours on Snyder Avenue might lose you instead of the other way around. You understand what I'm saying? He tipped an imaginary hat and walked back into the dark. Hazel stood in the rain until her uniform stuck to her skin. Then she went back inside and refilled old Sam's coffee and smiled at him like nothing in the world was wrong. If you're already feeling something for Hazel, do her a small favor right now. Hit that like button. Share this story with someone who has ever been the strongest person in the room and had no one notice. Because what happens in the next 4 minutes is going to change everything, and I want you here for it. At 3:14 in the morning, the bell above the door jingled again, and a man walked into Ruby's diner soaked to the bone. He wore a torn charcoal wool coat that had once been expensive and now looked like it had slept under an overpass. 3 days of dark stubble shadowed a jawline carved from granite. His black hair was plastered to his forehead by the rain. He carried no umbrella, no wallet visible, no phone in his hand. He sat down at the counter without a word and stared at the menu like he could not read English. From the back office, Marcus's voice cut through the diner. "Hazel, get him out. We don't serve his kind. He's gonna scare off the customers." There were no other customers. Old Sam was asleep in booth 4. Ruth was scrubbing the flat-top grill and pretending not to hear. Hazel walked over to the stranger. She did not ask if he could pay. She did not ask his name. She reached under the counter, poured a mug of coffee that was actually hot for once, and set it in front of him. Then she went to the kitchen, plated up 2 scrambled eggs, a piece of buttered toast, and a mound of hash browns from the batch Ruth had just finished, and set it down in front of him with a fork wrapped in a paper napkin. "On the house," she said quietly. "Don't tell my manager." The stranger lifted his eyes to hers for the first time. They were the darkest eyes she had ever seen, and they were not empty. They were reading her the way her father used to read a crime scene. Slow, careful, missing nothing. Something flickered behind them that she could not name. He picked up the fork and ate like a man who had not eaten in a very long time. She wiped down the counter around him, moving in the quiet rhythm that had become her armor. After a long minute, he said, without looking up, "Why?" Hazel paused. She looked at the rain running down the plate glass window and at the reflection of her own tired face floating in it. "My father used to say the world is full of storms. The least we can do is be a doorway." The stranger went very still. His fork stopped halfway to his mouth. He set it down carefully on the plate, as if the words had weight and he needed both hands free to hold them. He looked at her again, and this time something in his face had shifted. It was not gratitude. It was recognition, though of what she couldn't say. "What's your name?" he asked. His voice was low, quiet, roughened by exhaustion, but there was something underneath it, something you could feel in your ribs before you heard it in your ears. It was the voice of a man who did not need to raise it ever, because everyone around him was already leaning in. "Hazel. Hazel Monroe." He nodded once slowly, as if filing it somewhere permanent. He finished his food in silence. When he stood to leave, he patted the pockets of his ruined coat and shook his head, and for the first time embarrassment flickered across his face, quick as a match flaring. He met her eyes and started to apologize. Hazel reached into her apron. She pulled out the last crumpled dollar bill she had, the one she had been saving for the bus home, so she wouldn't have to walk 2 miles in the rain. She pressed it into his palm and folded his cold fingers around it. His hand was rough. There was a small scar across the knuckle of his index finger that looked old, and another, thinner, along the back of his wrist that looked more recent. "Get yourself something warm on the way," she said. "It's a long night." He did not let go of her hand right away. His fingers closed around hers for exactly 1 second longer than they should have. And in that second Hazel felt her heart do something it had not done in 6 years. It hitched. It skipped. It reminded her she was still alive. "Hazel Monroe," he said quietly. "I won't forget this." Then he pushed the door open and walked out into the rain, and the bell above the door jingled behind him. And Hazel stood at the counter with her hand still warm from his, and no idea that the entire architecture of her life had just changed. Ruth appeared at her shoulder, drying her hands on a dish towel, staring at the door. Her voice was low and strange. "Girl, do you know who that was?" No, Hazel shook her head. "Just some guy caught in the rain." Ruth watched the door for a long moment. Somewhere far off, a police siren wailed and faded. "I've been alive 68 years, sweetheart. I've served coffee to bishops and bookies, and one governor who cheated on his wife 3 tables down. I've never in my life seen a hungry man walk like a king." She patted Hazel's arm and went back to the grill. 3 blocks away, a black armored SUV sat idling with its lights off against the curb of a shuttered laundromat. The stranger opened the back passenger door and slid inside, without a word. The interior smelled of leather and gun oil and, faintly, of sandalwood. A man in a black suit sitting in the driver's seat turned around, taking in the ruined coat and the soaked hair with an expression that was somewhere between concern and quiet amusement. "Boss, you look like something," the harbor spat back. Alessandro De Luca, 34 years old, heir in hand of the De Luca family, silent owner of 40% of the shipping contracts moving through the port of Newark, majority stakeholder in 3 construction unions, controller of 2 private banks, and the man whose signature had quietly appeared on the lease of 118 commercial buildings across Manhattan and Brooklyn in the last decade, looked down at the crumpled dollar bill in his palm. He did not put it in his wallet. He did not throw it away. He folded it once, carefully, along the creases she had already made, and slipped it into the inside breast pocket of his ruined coat. Over his heart, Enzo Ricci, his underboss and closest friend since they were 15 years old, watched him do it and raised one eyebrow. He had known Sandro through 3 wars, 1 assassination attempt, the death of Sandro's father, and the funeral of his mother. He had never in 15 years seen his boss keep a piece of paper. "Where to?" Enzo asked carefully. Sandro looked out the rain-streaked window at the glowing yellow rectangle of Ruby's Diner in the distance. "Pull every file we have on that building. The lease, the manager, the block. Get me the name of every employee on the payroll. And find out who's holding a medical debt on a Jamie Monroe, born Brooklyn, brother to a Hazel Monroe waitress." He paused, and his voice dropped a full octave. "Tonight, Enzo. Before I sleep." Enzo was already dialing. "Anything else?" Sandro's jaw tightened. The scar on the back of his wrist was throbbing the way it always did when he had made a decision he had not yet spoken aloud. "The manager. Marcus something. He spoke to her in front of me like she was garbage. I want him breathing. I want him poor. I want him understanding, by the end of this week, exactly what he touched. Consider it handled." Enzo hung up and made 3 more calls in the space of 90 seconds. The SUV pulled away from the curb in silence. Sandro pressed his hand flat against his breast pocket, feeling the faint square of the folded dollar against his ribs. He had walked out of a 14-hour tactical negotiation with the Volkov syndicate over a disputed shipping lane in the Verrazano Channel. He had told his security detail to go home. He had wanted to feel the city breathe. He had not eaten in 19 hours. And a woman with tired eyes and a locket at her throat and a smile that cost her something had looked at him like he was a person worth feeding, and had given him the last dollar she had in the world without knowing his name. If you're still with me, take 1 second right now and subscribe to this channel. Not for me, for her. Because Hazel Monroe is about to walk into a firestorm she did not start and cannot see. And by the time this story ends, 3 men are going to wish they had never heard her name. The next morning at 8:04 a.m., Hazel walked through the sliding doors of Kings County Hospital, carrying a paper bag with 2 egg and cheese sandwiches from the diner. Jamie was awake, propped up in the mechanical bed, thinner than the last time she'd seen him. His hair had gotten too long. His 19-year-old eyes had the flat, patient look of a boy who had spent 3 years learning how to wait. "Hey, hotshot." Hazel set the bag on the tray table and kissed his forehead. "Ruth sent extra bacon." "You look tired, Hayes." "I'm always tired. It's my aesthetic." She sat on the edge of the bed and started unwrapping his sandwich. She did not tell him about Vic Ramone. She did not tell him about Marcus. She did not tell him about the stranger in the rain, or about the way her hand still felt like it was holding something warm. She told him she'd gotten a raise. She told him the surgeon's office had called with good news. She told him lies that tasted like copper on her tongue, and she smiled while she told them, because her father had taught her one thing above all others. The people you love should never see the storm you are carrying. They should only ever see the doorway. And somewhere on the 68th floor of a glass tower on the Hudson, Alessandro de Luca was already tearing the world apart to build her a new one. By 9:17 that morning, Enzo Ricci was standing in the corner office of a 42nd floor penthouse overlooking the Hudson, watching his boss read a manila folder in complete silence. Sandro had showered and shaved. He wore a charcoal Tom Ford suit that fit him the way armor fits a knight, and a black silk tie knotted with the precision of a man who did not tolerate crooked things. The ruined wool coat from the night before had been sent to a private tailor in Milan for restoration. The crumpled dollar bill was folded inside a small leather billfold on his desk, sitting on top of a stack of shipping manifests like a paperweight worth more than the building. The folder in his hands contained everything Enzo's people had assembled in 6 hours. Hazel Monroe, 26, born Brooklyn, only surviving parent deceased, mother remarried in Scottsdale and unresponsive to 2 attempted contacts. Younger brother Jamie Monroe, 19, T6 spinal cord injury from a drunk driving collision 3 years prior. Currently indebted to Northeast Medical Collections for $140,000 at an interest rate that was borderline illegal in 7 states. Employer of record, Ruby's Diner LLC, operating in a building whose lease had been quietly folded into a DeLuca shell company 9 months ago as part of a routine block acquisition. Direct supervisor, Marcus Vale, nephew of Harold Vale of Vale Realty Holdings, a mid-tier firm currently under IRS review for irregularities Sandro's people had been feeding to the auditor for 18 months. And underneath all of it, on a single sheet of cream-colored paper, was a note in Enzo's careful handwriting. The medical debt was purchased 3 months ago by Damien Thorne through a shell called Meridian Recovery. Thorne has been quietly consolidating predatory paper across 5 boroughs. He does not know we know. Sandro closed the folder. He set it down on the desk. He looked out the window at the gray river below, where a DeLuca-flagged container ship was making its slow way toward the harbor. When he spoke, his voice was so quiet Enzo had to lean forward to catch it. Buy the debt. All of it. Every family Thorne has his claws in. I want the paper transferred to the foundation by close of business. Then I want him invited to a conversation. And the manager? Freeze his uncle's assets by Thursday. Coordinate with our friend at Treasury. Marcus keeps his kneecaps. He loses everything else. Enzo permitted himself the smallest smile. And Miss Monroe? Sandro turned from the window. His dark eyes had the look Enzo had only seen twice in 15 years, once at his mother's grave and once on the night the Volkov brothers had made the mistake of putting a bounty on a DeLuca cousin. It was not rage. It was worse than rage. It was a man who had made up his mind. Tonight, Sandro said, I go back to Ruby's Diner. Alone. At 3:11 a.m. on Wednesday morning, Hazel was refilling the sugar caddies when the bell above the door jingled. She looked up, and every drop of blood in her body forgot how to move. The stranger from the rain was standing in the doorway. Except he wasn't a stranger anymore, and he wasn't ruined. He wore a black overcoat over a charcoal suit that must have cost more than her yearly wages, and the collar of his white shirt was open at the throat, and his dark hair was combed back cleanly, and the 3-day stubble was gone. His jawline looked like it had been drawn by an architect who believed in the golden ratio. He was staring straight at her, and only at her, and the diner around them ceased to exist. Marcus Vale, who had been in the middle of berating Ruth about a saucepan, looked up. All the color drained from his face in stages. First his lips went white, then his cheeks, then the tips of his ears. He seemed to physically shrink 2 inches. Mr. DeLuca, Marcus whispered, and the whisper carried in the empty diner the way a slammed door carries in a church. Sir, I had no idea. I mean, I never, please, whatever you need on the house anything. Sandro did not look at him. He walked past Marcus as if the man were furniture, sat down at the same seat at the counter he had occupied 24 hours earlier, and rested his hands on the chipped formica. He looked up at Hazel. I owe you $1, Miss Monroe. Hazel's mouth opened and closed. Her hand had drifted to her father's locket without her permission. Behind her, Ruth was staring like she had just watched Moses part the formica. Behind Sandro, Marcus was standing frozen in the middle of the aisle with his hand on a saucepan, and he had begun, very quietly, to sweat. You, Hazel managed. You're Alessandro de Luca. Sandro, if you prefer. He said his own name the way another man might say the weather. Neutral, factual, devastating. I was not, last night, a stranger caught in the rain. I was a man who had walked out of a very long meeting because he wanted to feel a city he owns most of, and had forgotten what it looked like at the level of the street. You reminded me. He paused. You also fed me, which no one has done, without an agenda, in 14 years. Behind her, Ruth made a small sound that was almost a laugh and almost a sob. Marcus made no sound at all, because his throat had stopped working. Sandro finally turned his head, slowly, and looked at Marcus for the first time. The temperature in the diner seemed to drop 10 degrees. When he spoke, his voice had not risen a single note, but Marcus flinched, as if he had been struck. Marcus, I have on my desk a ledger of every tip you have stolen from this woman across 3 years of employment. I have recordings of 6 occasions in the last month alone on which you humiliated her in front of customers over her body, her posture, or her pace. I have your uncle's federal filings, which are, as you may have heard by now, currently frozen pending review. You will refund every stolen dollar to Miss Monroe by Friday at noon. In cash. In person. With an apology delivered in front of every employee of this establishment. If any part of that instruction is unclear, Enzo will be visiting your apartment on Wednesday evening to clarify it. Do we understand each other? Marcus nodded, so fast his glasses slid halfway down his nose. He did not speak. He did not seem capable of speaking. He backed toward the office door and disappeared through it, and the lock clicked from inside, and no one in the diner would see him again for the rest of the night. Sandro turned back to Hazel. His expression had softened by a fraction. Miss Monroe, last night you fed a stranger you believed had nothing. Tonight, I would like to buy you dinner as a man who has, as it happens, quite a lot. I would consider it an honor. May I have the privilege? Hazel looked at Ruth. Ruth, whose arthritis had not permitted her to lift anything above shoulder height in 6 years, physically threw a dish towel at her. Girl, if you say no, I will haunt you from beyond the grave, and I am not even dead yet. Hazel, whose hands had never shaken in 6 years of catastrophe, felt them shake now. She looked at Sandro de Luca, at the man who had held her fingers 1 second too long in the rain, at the man who had apparently spent 24 hours quietly rearranging her entire life without asking her permission, and she heard her father's voice somewhere in the back of her mind saying the measure of a person, Hazelbug, is what they do next. I get off at 11, she said. 2 nights later, at a tiny family-run trattoria on Mulberry Street where the owner kissed Sandro on both cheeks and called him Sandrino. Hazel sat across from him in the only good dress she owned. It was deep burgundy, sent by her mother for her 24th birthday, and it fit her the way clothes fit women who had learned to love the shape of themselves anyway. Sandro looked at her across the candlelight the way a man looks at a stained glass window when the sun finally hits it. He asked about Jamie. He asked about her father. He asked about the criminology degree she had walked away from. And when she told him her father had trained her to read micro-expressions and detect lies before she was old enough to drive, he set down his wine glass and said quietly, "That is the second most valuable thing anyone has told me this year." "What's the first?" she asked. "That the world is full of storms." His dark eyes held hers. "And the least we can do is be a doorway between the pasta course and the tiramisu." He slid a manila envelope across the tablecloth. Hazel opened it with hands she willed to be steady. Inside were 2 documents. The first was a receipt from Northeast Medical Collections, marked paid in full in red ink, $140,000. dated that morning. The second was a scheduled surgery date at New York Presbyterian for Jamie Monroe, 3 weeks from that Friday, with Dr. Eileen Kovacs, the best pediatric spinal neurosurgeon on the Eastern Seaboard, cost covered in perpetuity by an anonymous foundation registered in Delaware. Hazel tried to speak. Nothing came out. A single tear slid down her cheek and landed on the receipt, blurring the ink. Sandro reached across the table and caught the next one with his thumb before it fell. His hand lingered against her cheek for a moment longer than it needed to. "You gave me your last dollar, Hazel," he said quietly. "I am simply returning it, with interest." If this moment just hit you the way it hit her, do me one small favor. Drop a comment below with the words "doorway" in the storm. I want to see how many of you understand what that means. Because what happens next is the part where the men who hurt her learn exactly what it costs. At 2:47 the following morning, in a warehouse on the Red Hook waterfront that had officially been condemned for 6 years and unofficially been used for exactly one purpose for the last 2, Damien Thorne was on his knees on a concrete floor. He was 45, silver at the temples, wearing a bathrobe and one slipper because Enzo's men had collected him from his brownstone in Park Slope at 1:34 a.m. and had not permitted him time to dress. His face was wet. It was not from the rain. There was no rain inside the warehouse. Sandro walked into the light of a single hanging bulb, adjusting his cufflinks. He did not speak for a full minute. He simply looked at Damien Thorne the way a coroner looks at a body. "You threatened a young woman in an alley behind a diner I own," Sandro said finally, and his voice was so soft that Damien had to strain to hear it, which was, of course, the entire point. "You attached 42% interest to the medical debt of a 19-year-old boy in a wheelchair. You told a widow's daughter she would lose her apartment on Snyder Avenue by Friday. You sent Vic Ramone to whisper in the dark like a man too cowardly to speak in daylight. 'Please,' Damien whispered. 'Please, Mr. DeLuca. I didn't know. I didn't know she was. She is not mine.' Sandro's voice dropped another notch. 'She is her own.' Which is precisely the point you failed, in your entire miserable career, to understand. You do not need to belong to a powerful man to be worth protecting. You need only to be a human being. This is a concept that will now be explained to you across the remainder of your life." Enzo stepped forward with a leather portfolio. "Every predatory loan on your books involving a family below the federal poverty line has been transferred, as of 2 hours ago, to the Monroe Family Foundation, incorporated this morning in the state of Delaware. All such debts are forgiven, effective immediately. Your remaining operations have been reported to the New York State Attorney General's office in a package delivered anonymously at 4 a.m. yesterday. Your accounts are frozen. Your associates have taken new employment. Your name is, as of tonight, retired from the 5 boroughs. You are permitted," Sandro said, "to leave New York. Once. Tonight. On a bus. In that bathrobe. If I ever hear your name in this city again, I will not hear it a second time. Do we understand each other, Damien?" Damien Thorne nodded, weeping. He was placed in the back of an unmarked sedan at 3:12 a.m. and driven to the Port Authority. He bought a ticket to a town in western Pennsylvania whose name no one in this story will ever say aloud. He was never seen in New York again. By 9 o'clock the following morning, Marcus Vale arrived at Ruby's diner to find the locks changed and a very quiet man in a gray suit standing on the sidewalk, holding a cardboard box containing Marcus's personal belongings. Inside the box was a termination letter, a check for $0 representing his final paycheck, from which every dollar he had ever stolen from Hazel had been deducted and rerouted, and a copy of a federal filing indicating that Vale Realty Holdings had, as of 8 a.m., ceased to exist as a solvent entity. His uncle Harold Vale was, at that moment, being interviewed by 2 federal agents in a conference room in Foley Square. Marcus stood on the sidewalk in the rain, holding his cardboard box, and every single person in the neighborhood who walked past that morning looked at him and then looked away, because word travels fast in Brooklyn, and everyone already knew that the fat waitress at Ruby's had a friend now, and the friend had reached out one hand and closed it, and this was what was left. 3 weeks and 2 days later, Hazel sat in a private waiting room on the 6th floor of New York Presbyterian, holding a paper cup of coffee she had not drunk. She had been in that chair for 11 hours. Sandro had been in the chair beside her for 11 hours. He had not taken a single phone call. He had not checked his watch. He had not spoken more than a dozen words. He had simply sat next to her, close enough that his shoulder touched hers, and been present in a way that no one in her life had been present since her father died. When Dr. Kovacs finally pushed through the double doors at 8:47 in the evening, still in her surgical scrubs, and said the words, "He will walk again, it will take time, but he will walk," Hazel collapsed sideways into Sandro's chest and sobbed the 6 years of grief she had been carrying since a stairwell in East New York and a red light on Atlantic Avenue, and every dollar she had ever counted twice. Sandro held her without saying a word. His hand cradled the back of her head. His other arm wrapped around her shoulders. He did not shush her. He did not tell her it was going to be okay. He simply let her weep, and Enzo, watching from the corner of the room, quietly signaled to the security detail to give them the floor. Later that night, on the terrace of Sandro's penthouse, wrapped in his suit jacket, looking out at the black river stitched with light, Hazel finally asked the question she had been carrying since the diner. "Who are you, Sandro?" "Really," he told her. "All of it. The legitimate businesses and the illegitimate ones. The shipping contracts and the shadow banks. The family he had inherited at 23 when his father was killed by a car bomb outside a restaurant in Bensonhurst. The choices he had made. The blood on the ledger of his life, which he did not pretend was small. He did not soften any of it. He did not make himself the hero of his own story. "I am not a good man, Hazel," he said, staring out at the river. "I have done things you would not forgive if I described them in daylight. I do not deserve you. I know this. But you looked at a stranger in the rain and decided he was worth a dollar you did not have. No one has done that for me since I was a boy of 9 years old. I would like, if you will allow it, the chance to be worth that dollar." She was quiet for a long time. She listened to the river. She thought about her father, who had worn a shield and believed in a law that had failed him in a stairwell. She thought about Jamie, who was at that very moment sleeping in a hospital bed with feeling returning to his legs for the first time in 3 years, because a man with blood on his hands had signed a check without asking her permission. She thought about doorways and storms. "My father used to say," she said finally, "that the measure of a person isn't what they've done. It's what they do next." She took his hand. She did not say yes. She did not say no. She said, "Let's find out." 1 year later, on a rainy Tuesday at 2:47 in the morning, the bell above the door of the newly renovated Ruby's Diner jingled, and a young woman walked in soak from a rain, exhausted from her second job, wearing the shape of a life that was crushing her. She sat at the counter without looking at anyone. Hazel Monroe, now co-owner of the diner, part-time criminology student at John Jay, director of the Monroe Family Foundation, which had, in 12 months, forgiven the predatory debts of 1,143 families across the 5 boroughs, walked over and poured her a mug of coffee. She set down eggs, toast, hash browns. She said, "On the house." The young woman looked up, stunned. Hazel smiled the smile her father had taught her. "My dad used to say the world is full of storms," she said quietly. "The least we can do is be a doorway." Outside, across the rain-slick street, in the back of an armored black SUV, Alessandro de Luca watched through the window and pressed his hand flat against his breast pocket, where a folded dollar bill, worn soft at the creases, still sat over his heart. Hazel Monroe gave a stranger her last dollar, and it turned out to be the loudest sound the universe ever made. Sometimes the smallest act of kindness, given by someone who has nothing left to give, is the exact moment the world decides to change its mind about you. Do you think Hazel made the right choice loving a man like Sandro? Or did she trade one storm for a darker one? Let us know in the comments below. If this story moved you the way it moved me to write it, smash that like button, share it with someone who has ever felt invisible in a room full of people, and subscribe to this channel for more thrilling stories of quiet strength and dangerous love. Because in the end, the ones who give everything when they have nothing are always the ones who were meant to have it all.